I'm going to teach you the infinite money glitch for electronic repair techs. Let's chase that fix. Okay, so we have here in front of me a board that I have purposely shorted the 5-volt rail. This board here is a donor board, so we pull parts from this board all the time. But the cool thing is the shorted component that I put on this board is actually from a real world experience of a PlayStation 5 having a dead short on the 5-volt rail. So I took that shorted component and I put it back in its place on this board, so we can use this as a teaching and demonstration purpose of how to find a dead shorted rail or dead shorted component. Now, with the experience I've gained from working on boards, before you go looking for a shorted component, you need to know what voltage your rail is at. So if your volt is 12 volts, 5 volts, 3.3, 1.8, 1.2, half a volt, etc. Because you're going to find on a lot of these boards that if you have a rail that's like 12 volts or 5 volts or 3.3, you're going to notice that you're going to have several thousand to several million ohms on a circuit. So what you actually just saw is I had my multimeter in ohms mode and I touched the 12 volt and the ground of the motherboard, and we had a reading of several thousand ohms. Now if you do that for the 3.3 volt rail, the 5 volt rail, the 12 volt rail, and some other rails, but usually if it has a higher voltage, it's going to have a much higher resistance to ground. Now if you have like a CPU or GPU rail, typically these rails are going to be low impedance to ground. So you'll actually measure with your ohms mode. If you measure like say here, you're going to get a reading of like 0.5, which looks like a short to ground. But in reality, this is a very low voltage circuit with high current flowing through it. And for the CPU and GPU, they typically have low impedance to ground, which ultimately means if you're going to test for a short circuit here, more than likely you're going to test like it's short, but it's not actually short. And typically if your board doesn't turn on, unless the actual chip is shorted, you're probably not going to find an issue here. Now I already measured the 12 volt rail, so now I'm going to look for the 5 volt rail, and I know where the 5 volt rail is on the PS5. It's actually right over here in this area. Now of course this board I have taken so many components off. There used to be a MOSFET here, a MOSFET here, a MOSFET driver here, and a fuse right over here. But alas, they're all gone. They were used for other PS5s. So what ends up happening is this is the 12 volt rail. 12 volts comes in here, and then 5 volts is somehow produced on this rail here, goes through this coil, comes over here, goes through a fuse here, and then this is the 5 volt rail right here. Now with our multimeter in ohms mode, let's go ahead and put one probe on ground and one probe on the 5 volt rail. And as you can see, our 5 volt rail is shorted directly to ground. Just from my experience from in the past, I usually thought if we measure a short here, it must be a capacitor or something in this area. And that's not always true. Sometimes your shorted component can be somewhere else on the complete opposite side of the board. Remember that these 5 volt and 12 volt rails, they go throughout the entire board. What could be 5 volts here is 5 volts somewhere else on the complete opposite side of the board. So the absolute best way, in my opinion, to find a dead short is to do some voltage injection. So let me show you how to inject voltage into your board safely. First, we're going to set the power supply to 1 volt. Now what we're going to do is we're going to connect our 1 lead to our ground here, and then we're going to inject voltage onto our 5 volt rail. And as you can see, there is like a 2 amp current draw here. So we know that our 5 volt rail is in fact shorted to ground. Now there are many ways to find where the shorted component is, because something is drawing current around this board and it's taking a lot of heat, because 2 amps is a lot of current. A lot of people will use alcohol to put it around on the board on different components and then just see what evaporates the alcohol very quickly. The most efficient way is to use a thermal cam. So let's use our thermal cam to find this short. So we're looking at our PS5 board, and I'm going to inject voltage in 3, 2, 1. Oh, there it is right there. So we can look over the whole board, of course, and we don't see anything except my hand maybe over here. Well, let's inject voltage again, and there it is, showing up right there on the thermal cam. Now, we've tracked down the component to be this capacitor right here on the 5 volt rail. Let's get rid of this capacitor and see if it clears our short. Alright, now that the cap's removed, let's measure in ohms mode and see if our short is gone. Alright, so we measure in ohms mode, and as you can see, we have several thousand ohms now on our 5 volt rail. So that means our short is entirely cleared, and this board would probably work if it wasn't a donor board. I wanted this to be as simple as possible to understand. I know that all electronic knowledge is not entirely simple, but if you understood what I just did, then congratulations, you just got a free infinite money glitch as an electronic technician. You're welcome.